Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I'm going to show you how to cut a mortise and tenon, a variation called a through wedged mortise and tenon. Very strong joint, but I've simplified it. I think you're going to like this. Stay with me. I'll walk you through the process. Mortise and tenon has been around a long time. It's probably one of the most common joints in furniture. Typically you never see it. It's hidden away and you only see it if it fails. Very common in chairs and in tables. So it's a square protrusion from one piece going into the opposing piece into a hole the same size. We call that the mortise. This is called the tenon. Like I said, you rarely ever see it. However, there are times when you can strengthen it and make it a decorative feature. Classic example. This is called a through wedge tenon. So what you're seeing right here, these three pieces, this is a part of this horizontal divider, and it's come through a hole called a mortise that has been shaped like a dovetail, meaning it's wider on this side than it is on the inside. Before you put it in, you make two cuts in the tenon. You can see the where it's been divided right there. You slope those cuts so that they'll easily bend open. After you put it through, you drive wedges in from this side that fill that difference in the size between this side and that side. Bottom line is that you create an internal dovetail, very strong joint. However, there are times when it's very difficult to do that, and I don't know if it's actually necessary. So let me open up one of these and show you exactly what I mean. This is one I recently did in a demonstration. So you'd end up seeing it like this on the opposite side, and I often use a different colored wood just to accentuate it. When you cut it open, you can see. So what we've done is we have created a dovetail shape mortise, and then that slope is filled by this wedge, which is that amount that was different between here and down here. And if you fill it properly, it goes in there. When you've glued all these pieces together, essentially you have 5 pieces of wood glued together to make one piece. What I'm going to suggest is I don't think you need to make these cuts, because if you consider that little bit of connective tissue right down there holding this piece to the rest of it is so small, it's insignificant. If you move it too far in, well, it would strengthen that. It makes it very difficult for the wedge to bend this piece over, and you're almost always going to end up having a split come down here. Whereas if this piece is very small, it'll easily bend over, allowing the wedge. Problem is, when you have to do that before you assemble, there's times that that little piece gets knocked off and it just becomes a bit of a pain. Actually, a lot of a pain. So this is where I typically have used it, but I want to show you an example where second time I've used this new method. So we're building a tool cabinet, and instead of using the traditional through wedge tenon where you split it, I simply added the wedges on either end, and I think it's the same thing, because once it's glued together, whether it's 5 pieces glued together to make one or 3 pieces glued together to make one, it's all the same. So I'm going to use a couple pieces of walnut. I'm going to cut a mortise in this one. I'm going to cut a tenon on the end of this one. Okay, if we were going to build a piece of furniture, obviously we'd have this carefully laid out. I'm doing a demonstration, but same thing, just obviously with a little more care and attention to where it's actually being placed. So this is the piece that I'm going to cut my mortise through. This is my tenon. I've squared up the ends and the edges. Mortise gauge. So I'm going to use a 3/8 mortise chisel, and the first thing I'm going to do is take that chisel and I'm going to set it between the two cutters. This is our mortise and gauge that we developed in conjunction with a friend named Paul up in Ontario, Canada several years ago. Works wonderfully. That locks it. Now I have to decide how long the tenon is going to be, and since it's going to pass all the way through and then go it's going to pass all the way through. We don't have to worry about that. That's another big advantage. Used to be that when you were trying to calculate your tenon, knowing that the outside edges were going to fold over, you had to make sure your tenon was long enough so that it didn't sink below the surface. I'll show you what I mean. This tenon had to be longer than this distance, because when this was pushed off to the side, you didn't want this sinking below the surface, and that means you got to take off even more material to try to flush it up. Don't have to do that with this one, so we can simply set it. And just for the sake of having a little bit to play with, I'm going to set it so that the cutter is just hanging over the edge. when I put this together, the tenon will actually be a little bit proud of that surface. I'm going to take that dimension. I'm going to scribe a nice heavy line all the way around. You'll see why we want that to be heavy when it comes time to cutting the actual tenon. Same thing across the edge. Opposite face. An edge. Nice deep line. I'll set this over here in the vise. Now I want to center this, and again, for demonstration purposes only, you may or may not want it to be centered. So the easiest way to do that is simply eyeball it first, lock the cutter head, push down, and then swing it around like this and see if those marks line up. They didn't quite this way, and I'm going to take multiple passes, deepening it each time. That'll just help when it comes time to cutting the tenon. Then we can make a pass down the face, or the edge I should say, and then down the edge here as well, right down to the line. Put a couple more passes on there. I want that to be nice and deep. Okay, now let's come over here and do the layout. Actually, just before we do that, we have to determine the length. You always want a shoulder all the way around your tenon. That's what makes it nice and neat. And we have to have some shoulder out here in the end. So I'm just going to randomly adjust for the length of it, allowing about the same amount on either end. You don't have to. In fact, you want your joint to be as strong as possible. You want to preserve as much of this as possible, so I'll be a little bit less. So right about there. That looks to be centered, meaning I'm equal distance from either edge. Now, the nice thing about dividers is nothing changes. I'm going to transfer it right over to here, and this is going to be the inside. I'll put it right there. This is going to be the inside dimension of a tenon. Now I'm going to make these marks nice and pronounced so you can easily see it. I'll use my pen, set it right in the hole, draw a line across there, and one here. I'm going right out to the edge. Now we have to determine how much slope we want to have, and what I'm referring to is how much slope on this angled face. In other words, how much bigger is the opening of the tenon going to be on the inside compared to the outside. And the greater slope you have, the stronger the joint will be in terms of physical strength, because you can't pull this through that. If it was close, you might be able to if the wood compressed. And we don't want it too much, but I usually do it by eye. I just set it on here and just kind of look and see what seems right. So there's the setting. Right about like that. That actually is 12 degrees. So I'm going to take this just so I can transfer these marks. Draw that up side. And since it's 12 degrees on that side, I'll just move it over to here. 12 degrees. And do the same thing. Make sure those lines line up. And then I'm going to come out here and mark this across the face. Again, I'm making very pronounced marks, but that's for clarity, not so much how I would do it if I was actually cutting it. I'm going to come in here with my marking gauge, and I'm going to set it right about there. So this is going to be the far side of the mortise, and I'm going to run that line from, I should say the gauge mark, from line to line. This is square, so when I come over and do this, I know it'll be in the exact same spot. Now I'm going to save that setting. I've got a backup block here, and I've squared up a piece of, it's actually cherry. So this edge is square with this face. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our monthly newsletter has subscriber-only content, discounts monthly on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. I want to go in here and put a little tick right there and right there. Now I'm going to use this as a guide for my chisel. You'll see how it works. Draw that up. Can't do it, so I got to move it over to the 12. Where are you? Okay. Now we'll set that on there and go through that process again. Line it up with the marks. Line the marks on the block with the marks on the piece of walnut. Make sure that's in perfect position. Now I can clamp that. You want to clamp that securely. Now I'm going to take my mortise chisel. Now, our mortise chisels are square. When you put the square on there, a lot of them have a taper on them. I don't want that. And this works well because of that. I'm going to set this down. I'm going to use this block to keep it standing plumb. And I'm just going to take my time, taking about 1/8" chops at a time. I'm going to stay away from those outside marks, meaning this one and this one, until I get all the way down into my backer block. Go over to this side. Now I can still lever against this because I'm nowhere near that line. I just saw some white, so I know I'm all the way down to the bottom. So now I'll take about 1/16 of an inch at a time. Chop right to the bottom. Pry that up. You can see our pine down there, so we're all the way through. Go to the other side. Same thing. Okay, we've got most of it excavated. Now I'm going to go in there, turn my chisel the other way, and I'm going to start following, or getting close to that line. I'm watching my guide line on the side. Pull that back. I'll do this in a couple of stages so I'm not taking too much material at any given time. Now this one I'm going to put right on the line, and I'm going to do my best to follow that guide. Good reason to leave very little on the last chop. And you want that end wall to be nice and straight. Now go to this side and we'll repeat the process. That turned out to be nice and clean on the inside. And we look down here, we're right on the line, so that's exactly where we want it. So that's done. Now we can go ahead and focus on cutting the tenon. Now, I'm going to use a tenon saw to make these cheek cuts. And that's fairly stout. Sometimes if those are thin, I'll actually clamp a second piece of wood alongside to help keep that from folding out and not allowing the saw to track properly, meaning saw in a nice straight line. But before I go any further, it's nice to have a little track already started there. So I'm going to use. You want to be careful when you do this so as not to go beyond. But now that will give me a nice little trough to set my saw in. I'll flip it around and do the exact same thing on the other side. Unlike a regular mortise and tenon joint, nobody sees this part. But on this through wedged, this is going to be very visible. So you want to make sure that it fits perfectly. You want to protect these edges. Don't let them get bruised in the process of cutting them. All right, so that's good and clean. Now I'm debating whether or not to put a block in there. I think maybe I'll show you how I do it, just so that if you need to, you can, you know how. So a saw tracks, meaning it starts and stays on course, nice and straight, as a result of the set, meaning there's not more set on one side than the other. And if that's all perfect, the thing works beautifully. But if the support of the saw on one side is less than the other, meaning this gets to be a relatively narrow piece, a thin piece, that's going to have a tendency to wander or to push away like that, and that allows the saw to follow the path of least resistance. So what I do, will often do, is come in here and clamp a piece on, and not satisfied with just the vise alone, you can put in another clamp. Now I don't want to cut my clamp. When you start this, get the saw right up against that little trench. Get your kerf established. Now I can change all of my focus and attention. I don't need to pay attention to this at all. I'm going to watch the side over here. Now, first problem that you may encounter as you get a little older, I can't see that line to save my life. So what I'm going to do is go in there, I'm going to put a piece of tape on there, yellow tape, which really stands. All the tension down on the side. I sometimes keep my thumb on the top just until that saw gets down in there a little bit. If we can get this right from the saw, it saves a lot of work. When I say don't have to worry about it, I mean I don't have to watch what I'm doing other than paying attention right down here. Now I'm going to grab my bench hook and my crosscut saw. But just before I cut those shoulders off, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put a little trench in there. Remember I said to keep these lines nice and deep. Attack that at a high enough angle that it ensures you're not going to slip and go beyond your scribe line down into your good piece. Everything up here is waste. Now using a crosscut saw and a bench hook, I'll go in there, use my thumb and finger to squeeze this tight to the back fence. Set that right in the trough. And again, we're aiming to go right from the saw. So feel that up against, actually I got a piece of something in there. You want to keep that cut plumb. You don't want to cut on an angle. You'll see it on the outside edge. Now I'm going to put this in the vise. And the first thing I want to do is go in. I want to finish that cut. So you'll notice on this side I went all the way to the line, but on this side it stopped short, and I've got that material right there. So with the chisel tight against the cheek, I'll just go in and finish that. And then from this side I can come right in here and remove that material. Now, I find this next step, it's better you do it at this stage, and that is I need to get this thickness exactly right before I cut off this bit. Reason is, if I have to adjust it, sometimes the tool I use, meaning a router plane, will take little chips off that corner, and I don't want to lose those because they're going to be very visible out here in the surface. So just like this, I'm going to come in here, check that, and that seems to fit. That seems to fit in there just nicely. So now I can go ahead and I'm going to use a combination square because I can adjust the rule, just the depth that I need. Come in here and draw a line corresponding with that top mark down to the shoulder on both sides. Really important to get these two cut square. If you don't, when you put them together, it's going to show here. This is square, this is square, this has to be, this has to be. So I'll come in right up against that line, support the saw well. And when you're making your cut, careful that you don't go beyond your shoulders. If anything, stop a little bit short. It's easy to fix with a chisel. Before I go any further, I want to make sure my shoulder lines are nice and clean, so when I put it together, it comes up tight all around the perimeter. I'm going to grab a narrower chisel on this edge, so I'm not out here where it would show. It allows me to come right in, and if anything, undercut it slightly. Then I can do the long side, and that actually looks pretty clean, so I don't think I have anything to worry about there. Check this side. Now, if you can still see your gauge line made with a marking gauge, and if there's material above that, then you know it's not going to close. So I like to find that, set my chisel right on it, and just make a slight undercut, not extreme, but just enough to avoid any issues. Check that again. That's good. Okay, shoulders are good and tight all the way around. So now we got to cut our wedge. Now I'm going to use a piece of holly, and this stuff's expensive, so I don't throw anything away. So I got a small piece like that, and I think this is just long enough. It is just long enough to get 2 out of 1 strip. So we know how long it needs to be because it's going to be the length of the setting on the marking gauge, which was the length of the tenon. How wide, we're going to adjust that once we cut it. Now what we need to do is just draw the slope on there, and we can take that right off of here, which I believe was 12 degrees. Okay. This stuff is so white you can't tell end grain from long grain. So I'm going to draw this. First I'll mark the bottom, just enough to get a saw kerf in there. Mark across the end. Make sure that's wide enough. Just okay. Now we have to determine first the length or the width at the top. Put this back in for a second. Use my dividers. Same on both sides. I'm going to give it just a little bit extra for good measure. Now we'll come over from the end. Square a line across the end. Come on, move over. I don't like the fact that I got a big chunk out of there. Hopefully I'm going to be able to remove that. Now the bottom is actually going to be a point, unlike it is on a normal through wedge tenon where you're filling in a saw kerf. We're actually filling a spot. I'll get that in the vise so we can saw it. I'm going to use my Moxon vise, it's just easier to hold this. Now, when you get down there, squeeze over here, press that against the saw blade so that it doesn't fall off to the side. Now we want to fit these in there perfectly. And it's a right angle triangle, so I'm going to put the long side out there. I've got to adjust this. I'm using my little, what we call a mini shooting board. It just allows me to get a little tighter. The fence comes over closer. I work it with a block plane instead of a large 5.5. A little more blade. So open that throat up a bit. Okay, side is square. I'm just going to check on this end. Okay, that fits perfectly. That's the way it's going to go in. This one, I want to get rid of that side. It's got the big chunk out of it. I'll check the top too in case I introduce a taper, and I did, so take a little bit more off. I'll start my cut at about the midway point so that I'm not making this end any thinner. And you never want it to be too wide. It'll jut out and it'll show when you plane off the joint. You'll see that little divot where it pops out or pushes out. Yeah, a little bit more. That should be it. Okay, and the right angle triangle's out there, so that's the way they're going to go in. Now I can't get my spatula in there to do the ends, but I'm going to coat the wedges so I won't have to worry about that. Now make sure that's down tight. Take our wedges. Set that in there. Now you want adequate glue so that when it dries, 3 pieces will become one. Now tap that in place. I like to dry them out at the same time. Make sure that shoulder's tight. Now wipe that off, plane it up, and we'll even. It's been in the clamps for 45 minutes almost. So let's flush that off. One more. Now, I'm just going to throw a little bit of wax on there just to give it the wet look. And then we'll compare how that looks to the traditional through wedge tenon. Okay, so that's how that would look on the side of your cabinet. And if you want to have comparison, Mind it's in pine, so it's not exactly the same, obviously. Now, I'm going to take it over to the bandsaw, cut it right down the middle, and we'll have a look at it internally and see if we can see any reason why that would be any less effective than the traditional through wedged. So here's what it looks like. You can see when I made my shoulder cut, it went a little bit deep, that's why, but there's how it finishes. And there's the through wedge tenon where you've actually cut the outside pieces. So what's the big difference? Well, not having to make those cuts. Remember, if you leave this too wide, find a pointer. If you leave this bottom of the tenon too wide and drive a wedge in there, there's a good chance you're going to have a split. So it has to be narrow enough so that that'll easily bend, which often means it's so narrow that in the process of putting it together, these pieces get knocked off. I've had it happen more than once. So this is the solution. I think it works. You decide. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.